It's walking to the battleground that always makes me cry. I've met so few folks in my time who weren't afraid to die. But dawn bleeds with the people here and morning skies are red as young girls load up bicycles with flowers for the dead.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Talk Vietnam. Now, the American movement against the Vietnam War can be considered one of the most successful in American history and has played a key role in stopping the devastating war. Now, we are so honored to have three such anti-war activists in our studio today. They were extremely active during the war and they've supported Vietnam ever since the war ended. We have John McAuliffe, who has spent 40 years coming back and forth between the U.S. and Vietnam, trying to bridge the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. for reconciliation and development. We also have Janet Gardner, who is a filmmaker, and she has told the world about war legacies in Vietnam through her world-acclaimed documentaries broadcast on PBS, Discovery Channel, as well as the National Geographic Channel. We have Richard Nagin, an organizer for the Communist Party USA, and though he's never been to Vietnam before, he's always held a place for Vietnam in his heart. So thank you three very, very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about how your anti-war activities started. Can we start with Janet, maybe?
Well, let's see. I studied film under an old left-wing organizer, I guess you'd call him, or filmmaker. He's actually became a filmmaker, Leo Hurwitz. And he had us walking a picket line in front of NBC News for the way they were covering the war. That was kind of the beginning of it all. And then as a student, I went down to Washington. There were moratoriums once a month, the middle of the month. And people congregated, hundreds of thousands of people congregated in Washington. And we carried coffins through the streets and in front of the White House and sang and marched, and that was kind of my youth, my studying period when I was learning. Actually, I did more protesting in graduate school than I did filmmaking.
Protesting during your graduate days at
Right.
New York University.
Yes, that's right.
What about you, John? How did you get involved?
I first read about Vietnam when I was still in college at Carleton College in the spring of '64. Then I went to the Peace Corps in Peru. When I got back, what had been a peripheral issue had escalated into a major war. And like any male of that age group, I had to decide what I was going to do about the draft. So from my Peace Corps experience in Peru and my reading before I left, I knew that I was opposed to the war and therefore had to seek conscientious objector status, and became very involved almost from then on in anti-war work through a variety of channels, including being head of an organization of former Peace Corps volunteers.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Rick?
Well, I first heard about the war in Vietnam when I was a senior in college in 1964. A progressive journalist by the name of I.F. Stone came to my college and spoke about it, and it just outraged me what was happening. And then I went to graduate school. I was studying to be a biologist, but I became totally immersed in the movement to stop the war, and I was at the first national peace demonstration in 1965 in Washington at the Washington Monument. And after that, I just practically, like Janet, I did nothing in graduate school except work to end the war in Vietnam. It completely changed my life.
It's hard maybe for Vietnamese to understand the extent to which their sacrifice helped to transform the United States and made it a much, not a perfect society by any means, but a more diverse society, a more tolerant society of different kinds of people and organizations within it.
I was certainly anti-war. I can't say that I was a leader, but I went to important demonstrations against the war. And afterwards, after I came to Vietnam in 1988, I worked for a time with something called Indochina Project in Washington, D.C. And the purpose of that organization was to try to restore relationships with Vietnam and Cambodia. And we succeeded, I think, in doing that.
I decided to be part of the anti-war movement because I saw the terrible impact that the war was having on my neighborhood and my community. And many of the people that lived there that were losing jobs and were having many of their families torn apart by disagreements about the war.
My work with Vietnam inspired me to pursue a life of what we call economic and social justice and peace. And that's what I've done for many, many years.
I was very much involved in the campaign against the Vietnam War. And that also helped me lose my job at Vassar College, since my employer didn't like that kind of political activism. So I was denied tenure there, but I eventually got tenure and became a professor of history at the State University of New York at Albany.
My generation of people, the Vietnam War was one of the main central things that changed our lives, affected our lives, and many people developed their understanding of things because of their objection to the war.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the sacrifices that anti-war activists would have to make during their campaigns, during their movement?
Some were particularly grave. My brother, for example, was in the U.S. military. He was not drafted, but he went in to avoid being drafted. He was stationed at Cam Ranh Bay. He was a lieutenant at that point. He was adjutant to the commanding general. For him, I mean, he was against the war. So for him, the stress, which he still experiences, was to be in a situation of having to choose between protecting yourself and your friends and participating in a war effort that you didn't agree with. So that's that level. The people who left for Canada, their lives, most of them came back ultimately with amnesty, but their lives were disrupted. People did go to jail rather than accept military service, and they spent 2 or 3 years in jail. Rick's example of he was going to be a biologist, and who knows, we might have had here somebody who made a discovery that affected everyone's health or safety, and it didn't happen. And there are a lot of people whose lives were changed, and we hope positively, but it may have diverted them from other activities.
40, 50 years ago, when you were involved with the anti-war movements, did you face any difficulties at all?
There were a lot of family arguments. That's
true.
I think it was less intense in our family than in others. I mean, my friend Tom Hayden, for example, didn't speak to his father for 30 years. Wow. Because they became so alienated from each other during that. And his father was a military veteran of the Second World War. So there are a lot of family histories. In some of the demonstrations, people were physically attacked.
In 1970, 3 students were killed at Kent State by National Guardsmen in demonstration. And I think that had a big effect. It had a big effect on us at NYU.
At the same time, there was Jackson State in the South, where there was a mix of anti-war and civil rights issues, and even more students were killed. But there was a lot more attention. But the two things coming close enough produced a wave of strikes, student strikes all over the country. This was a movement. It was not a single organization. It included almost every sector of American society. And it's been said that this was both the largest peace movement in American history and the only successful peace movement in American history.
Hanoi is the first leg during their visit to Vietnam this time for the anti-war activists from the U.S. Some of them felt differently about the experience, but to some, the experience was extremely overwhelming. Let's take a look at their stories in Hanoi through the following report.
This is the moment Richard David Nagin, a retired journalist and member of Communist Party USA, has been waiting for so long. He is in Badin Square, visiting President Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum and this humble steel house where he spent his last years.
It's very moving to see him, to see this beautiful sight. And he lived a simple life, but he was totally focused on the one thing of winning the national independence and sovereignty for the Vietnamese people. And as an inspiration for the whole world.
Richard David Nagin is one among the 15 foreign anti-war activists who visited Vietnam on the 40th anniversary of the end of the American War. For many within this delegation, it is the first time they have visited Vietnam. On their visit, they learned a lot about President Ho Chi Minh.
I just couldn't believe how I felt when I saw Ho Chi Minh, you know. It was quite moving. As we left and went out, the woman next to me burst into tears, and we kind of hugged and we felt that.
It's moving for us here today to see the reverence in which he is held. And actually the most exciting thing was to see so many young school children so that they learn their own history and they know what an important role he played for the future of Vietnam.
During the Vietnam War, these anti-war activists played an active role in the anti-war movement, which took place throughout the United States.
And we put out a newspaper that rallied the people and explained to the people why this war was wrong and who was responsible. We organized demonstrations and marches in the cities. I was living in New York. We marched in the streets and we chanted, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win." And now they won.
Before leaving, all members of the delegation wished to have a photo at the Badin Square. They said that they would like to bring back home a memory of their visit to the place where President Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam on September the 2nd, 1945.
So tell us a little bit about Rick, about your Hanoi experience. You visited the Ho Chi Minh Presidential Palace.
Yes,
and you got really emotional.
I was, yes. I try not to get too emotional now, but you know, we went to the mausoleum and we saw Ho Chi Minh, but also we went to the museum and re-examined his life, his whole long history from 1919 until his death in 1969, when he fought endlessly, relentlessly, persistently for the independence and sovereignty of Vietnam. And his life, of course, is an inspiration for all people that, you know, who want to struggle for justice and peace and democracy. So just to see that was very emotional for me. One thing that always inspired me about Ho Chi Minh was that he was a wonderful poet. And there's one poem that he wrote that I've always kept. I forget, I don't know. I have it with me, actually.
You have the poem with you.
Yes.
Let's read it.
I don't know how to say it in Vietnamese, but it says, "Neither high nor very far, neither emperor nor king, you are only a little milestone, which stands on the edge of the highway. The people passing by, you point to people passing by, you point the right direction and stop them from getting lost. You tell them of the distance for which they must journey. Your service is not a small one, and people will always remember you.
Mm-hmm. And why do you keep the poem with you?
Because I think that it shows the character of Ho Chi Minh, and it's the communist character. I think, to me, it's the ideal of what I try to strive to be also. It shows the modesty of the movement, and yet the determination to succeed in the end. Yes.
For Richard, this may be the first time that he's visited Vietnam. But for John and Janet, after the war ended, they visited many, many times to try to bridge the relationships between the two countries, as well as the relationships between the two nations' people. Let's take a look at their bridging efforts in the next report.
John took these photos on April the 30th, 1975 in Hanoi, when the entire capital city was rejoicing in victory. John will never forget these historic moments.
On April 30th, 1975, with 4 other people, anti-war people, just by pure coincidence, we arrived in Hanoi. So I was here and had the immensely moving experience of being with people from Hanoi, walking around the One Kiem Lake and celebrating.
The efforts by John and his fellow anti-war activists were paid off, but John believed that those efforts needed to continue. In 1985, he launched the U.S. Indochina Reconciliation Project, which later became the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. Throughout the past 30 years, the organization has held tens of trips and seminars in both the U.S. and Indochina countries, including Vietnam. Their aim is to break down barriers and distrust, to build confidence and friendships between the people who were separated by war. John cannot count how many times he has been to Vietnam over the past 4 decades. It's the same with Janet Gardner. Since 1987, she has traveled to Vietnam many times to make films about the lives of war survivors.
Called it the last ghost of war.
My heart went out to the victims, and I thought anything I could do to help them, would not be a waste of time. I haven't really thought about trying to influence U.S.-Vietnamese relations. I don't know that I have that kind of power, really. If I can make good films and make people happy, and help people come together and understand better each other, then I'll be happy.
John and Janet are 2 among many people who have bridged the distance between the 2 countries who used to be on opposite sides of the war. Whether in wartime or peacetime, they have stood by Vietnam in its fight for peace and a better future for everyone.
Thank you.
So you're also one of the active players in rebuilding relationships between the U.S. and Vietnam. When did you first start, and how did the journey of coming back to Vietnam and helping U.S.-Vietnam relations begin?
Well, that journey started in 1975. That was the impact of being here then is what convinced me that the post-war work was as important as the wartime work. We supported Vietnam's membership in the UN. We called for assistance, humanitarian assistance to heal the wounds of war. We were very involved in that stage. I started my organization when I left the Quakers in 1985 and started organizing trips. You know, the whole idea was to try to find the vehicles for trust to be built and the two peoples to rediscover each other in a post-war context.
So was your focus mainly on people?
Well, people and policy. I did a lot of work in Washington, always, and one of the reasons we brought academics at the beginning, emphasized academics, is we thought that they would, as professional experts about Vietnam, they would have an influence in, again, changing a mindset. I mean, remember, Vietnam was the first war the U.S. lost. It was humiliated in many ways. I mean, you had years and years of trying to rebuild a new kind of attitude, and you know, and that's happened now. And so
Janet, you're also a catalyst, and you're the catalyst of stories. You tell stories about Vietnam and the Vietnam War through your films. So why did Vietnam inspire you?
With Precious Cargo. Precious Cargo was a story that at the time wasn't fully told, because there was the other story of, you know, the fall of Saigon, or the reunification of the North and South, and there were so many powerful stories that the story of the children that kind of got lost in the shuffle was one that I found myself attracted to. I made the documentary, and I was glad I did. I was kind of in a fortunate position. I met these kids, and it was amazing. I mean, they didn't know how to pronounce their names in Vietnamese, and so I kind of went around the country and met them. I found it fascinating to talk to each one of them, because I could see most of them were handicapped. They did not know their mother's names, and only one did.
Yeah.
And it meant so much to them to come to Vietnam and to try to find
a part of them that
yes,
they did not know before.
That they didn't know before. And so we went to the orphanages and we talked to the nuns, and it was a big discovery for me to see these stories. For the Agent Orange story, I really thought that was one that had to be told, and I did not think that the U.S. media is going to tell that story. They weren't. It's considered controversial, and it's a hard movie to watch.
Yeah.
And I think that I just felt it was part of me. Yes. I spent so much time on it as a newspaper reporter, and I knew the scientists, and I felt it just had to come together, and
you just had to.
I just had to put it together, and yes, and it's done fairly well abroad. It's the only one that PBS International is still marketing.
Now, before the trip to Vietnam, many anti-war activists only knew about the legacies of war through the media. But this time, they had a chance to see with their own eyes the sufferings that wrenched their heart of the Agent Orange victims. We'll take a look at what they saw in the next report.
The first family that the group visited was that of Quỳnh Ô and Canh Da, who are Tà ethnic people living in Per Nghi One hamlet, An Ngo commune. The couple provided logistic support in the war from 1963 to 1964. That was when they were exposed to Agent Orange dioxin. As a result, 3 of their children and 1 grandchild suffered from defects. Their eldest daughter, born in 1978, has severe motor neuron disease. The eldest son died of cancer, leaving behind a daughter also infected with Agent Orange dioxin. Their other son is mentally ill.
My heart goes out to the victims of Agent Orange. It's very hard to see them, and it's hard to know what to say to them and to their parents. I mean, it's a tragedy, but maybe it's good that we can show that at least we care enough to come over here and be with them and try to make some sense out of a very terrible war and hope that it will never happen again.
The second family that the group visited was Ganlei's, who is also a Da'oi person. Her husband was infected with Agent Orange dioxin and died of cancer in 1984. Her son, Gavin Buck, now 37 years old, was born with severe defects.
Now he's an adult, a 37-year-old adult, but there's nothing that will ever help him except some financial aid that would make it easier for his mother, and so that could still happen, could make their lives, and I'm sure she worries about what happens to him when she dies. So that's a long-running problem that many of these families have.
Visiting the family with victims of Agent Orange was very moving. And being a mother myself, it's especially difficult to see what the policies of my country have done during the war here. It reconfirms my gut reaction that war is not the way to solve our problems. It has only created problems, and it has created immense generational problems, and we have no right to do that to another people.
Agent Orange dioxin was sprayed by the U.S. Army in Thừa Thiên Huế province during the war. The province is home to over 4,300 Agent Orange dioxin victims. Among them are 450 third-generation victims.
Now, Rick, talking about Agent Orange, since we're on the topic, what were some of your impressions of Agent Orange before you came to Vietnam?
Well, I didn't really know too much about it, and I really appreciate the opportunity that John and his organization has provided so that we could actually see firsthand the legacy in terms of the human legacy. And we were able to visit with some families where we saw very humble people who were, living in their humble homes, who welcomed us. And what was really striking to me was their optimism and their good spirits, and that they, despite their tremendous disability, that they were, what I see here in Vietnam is that it's a caring society, and that even the people that were the most victimized, people are uniting behind them and supporting them and trying to make it possible for them to do the best they can. And that's very inspiring to see that. We have a big struggle in the United States about getting the right benefits for the American veterans, because many of them, as we mentioned earlier, are not treated well. They're neglected. Some of them are homeless and have mental problems and stuff like that, and they're just ignored, despite the fact that they, made these sacrifices on behalf of the government of the United States.
Now, Janet, in 1985, as a print reporter, you covered the Agent Orange hearings in New Jersey. Can you give us a little bit of information on what the U.S. government viewed Agent Orange back in the day?
Well, the U.S. government had a lot of different studies of Agent Orange. The hearings were a shock, I think, to the American public, because they didn't know about this, and a lot of veterans came from all over the country, and they were telling these stories of they were sterile. They talked about suspected birth defects. Yeah. They didn't know why they had these skin diseases, this acne, chloracne, they called it, and some of them, had visible scars on their faces and hands. And I felt that in a way I had a job to do to report whatever was going on, and the reporters were not, I don't think, treated very well in terms of gaining access to information.
Right.
You had to do a Freedom of Information Act to get evidence, to get anything, and there was just a lot of resistance.
Right. While in central Vietnam, the group of U.S. anti-war activists went to the visitor center of Project Renew, where they had a chance to meet and to know the sufferings of unexploded ordnance victims in Quang Tri province, many of whom are double amputees. These victims' strong will to live and their strong will, their determination to build a life of their own, truly touched the activists' hearts. Let's take a look.
55-year-old Do Thiên Đăng from Big Shea Hamlet, Triệu Phong district, lost both legs due to landmines from the war. The accident took place in 1980 when he went into the forest to collect palm leaves to thatch his roof. Since 2003, the livelihood of Đang's family has improved. This is after Project Renew in Quang Tri province gave them money to build a shed to cultivate mushroom. He earns over $450 from a single mushroom harvest per year.
Programs to generate income.
Besides meeting Đăng face to face, the American peace activists also saw him again in a video shown to visitors at the Mine Action Visitor Center in Quang Tri province.
This man has a strong spirit, and Project Renew gave him more energy to feed himself and his family.
To me, the whole war was so unnecessary and so wasteful, and the fact that lives are still 40 years later being disrupted, but at the same time, some of the people, their will to live, their will to produce, is overcoming that, and that's a tremendously inspiring thing, that people are saying, no, I'm not going to be just a victim, I'm going to take over what's happened to me and still be productive, still make, do things for myself, my family, and my country.
Đăng is among over 8,500 victims of landmine accident in Quang Tri province after the war ended.
The bomb may have taken his legs and one arm.
Quang Tri province also has the highest rate of landmine contamination in Vietnam, which affects 83% of its total area, according to a study by the Ministry of Defense.
What struck me was the resilience and commitment of these individuals not to feel sorry for themselves, but to carry on with their lives. They don't want our pity. They want just a little help to take care of themselves. And that is so impressive.
The trip left lasting impressions in the minds of the 15 peace activists, especially those who led the anti-war movements and protests during the Vietnam War, but had never stepped foot in Vietnam before.
It renews my sense of commitment to struggle for people and the friendship between people that's necessary. The world can only advance through friendship with people. War destroys, friendship builds. We need to build a world that's better.
So let's talk a little bit about the landmine victims, the victims of unexploded ordnance that you met. How did you feel when you witnessed their suffering, their pain, or their physical presence? For example, you met Do Thiên Đăng, if I'm not wrong. Let's start with maybe Janet.
I admired his courage and his graciousness in inviting us into his compound to witness his mushroom farm, and I think he didn't want us to feel sorry for him. I mean, I felt that we should try to treat him, with respect.
What about you, Rick? What was your impression?
It kind of had a special impact for me because my daughter grows mushrooms in our basement, and we have with the same kind of thing, there's bags of mushrooms that he had in his farm, and so to see him, and we saw a film about him also as he was climbing up these bags to harvest the mushrooms. So that'll be a big memory for me. And my wife is on the trip as well, so we took a lot of pictures to show our daughter how this is being done here. You know, how someone with this terrible disability is able to do the work that she is doing as well.
I'll come back a minute to the effects on the victims. These are not problems that will go away, and these are problems which are very expensive over time. I mean, he's doing very well with mushrooms, but if you ask him about how much of his family income comes from mushrooms, you know, it's not the whole year's income. He just grows one crop, and he does other things, and his wife works, and you know, so but the stresses will be there forever. Yes. The stresses on Agent Orange, where there is deeper problems, are there not just for the victims, but for those who care for them. And part of their stress is, what happens when I die? What happens when I can no longer be there? I mean, I'm glad the U.S. is taking a different attitude, but the need is far greater than we are addressing, either the need for rehabilitation for landmine victims or for custodial care for people with serious birth defects.
So to everybody, you know, after all of those years, what does Vietnam mean to you? So let's start with Rick, maybe, because this is the first time you've been to Vietnam.
Yes. Well, it means resilience. It means the continuing determination to fight for justice and for a good life for the people. I mean, the Vietnamese people are just remarkable and have made a tremendous contribution to mankind because of your determination and persistence, and never give up, never say die. And I think your determination to live in peace with your neighbors, I think that's very important. So that's a very important message, I think, that you project to the whole world.
Right. That's great. Thank you for those compliments. What about you, John?
Well, I'll turn it around a little bit and say, I mean, part of what Vietnam means to me are Vietnamese I know, have known for most of my adult life now, friends and colleagues and the children of those friends and colleagues, and but it also, Vietnam is when the U.S. begins to come to terms with itself. It's when it begins to recognize that history is important and that other people's views of themselves are important. It's when it begins to recognize that weapons have consequences, and even if you think you're doing something for the right reasons, the position you put your soldiers in leads them to do things that are terrible and not what you would ever have wanted them to do. These, I say the beginning because we then can quickly forget these things. We totally forgot them in terms of Iraq. And mostly forgot them in terms of Afghanistan. You know, the challenge for us, I mean, we're all of what's called the Vietnam generation, and we're retirement and beyond. I mean, we lose our friends, people who were tremendously important in the anti-war movement have now passed away. So our generation is moving away from this picture. We hope that our kids have learned something from us, either directly or indirectly, right, and are able to understand the wrongness of the war, the injustice of the war.
Janet, what about you? What does Vietnam entail for you?
Well, when we first landed here in 1987, first I was a little bit scared because I thought, because of all the people must really hate us because of all that had gone on. But that wasn't the case. And maybe because some of the work that John had done with the Vietnam American Friendship Society, we were given a very warm welcome wherever we went, and it seemed that people could understand the difference between the American people and the American government, and they seemed to realize that we didn't really want that war. It wasn't the war that we wanted, and I mean, it's been an ongoing experience, you know, a developing experience, and it was interesting to come back and see kind of a new Vietnam in a way.
Thank you all so much for being on the show today, and thank you, for in the past for being the heroes of peace and being the heroes of anti-war movements, even though you probably did not know the faces of the people that you were supporting, or the face of the country that you were supporting. And thank you for still continuing to do that now, that you know the faces of those people and you know the face of Vietnam, and continuing to bring peace forth. So thank you all for doing that.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and I wish you all very, very good health so that you can continue to come back next time, and we'll get to talk more and more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's it for this edition of Talk Vietnam. Thank you for tuning in with us, and we hope to see you next time. We'll talk again. Goodbye.